to you to reminisce, to think back of what it was like, when you were growing up in Brownsville? So I'll ask you some questions on that.
Well, Brownsville was a much different place. So was Matamoros. Matamoros had not received those waves after waves of poor people trying to come into the United States to make a better life. Brownsville was the county seat of Cameron County, and thus it had a great deal of the city, but you could just walk a few miles. You could go walking, would be out in the Chaparral. So we really were able to have both things. And really, I was telling somebody else that I lived, and most people that I knew lived different lives. For example, during the summers, my younger brothers and I all went across the river to a ranch that would have been my father's, and my father had decided to stay in the country. But the second son who took it over, we'd stay over there for almost 3 months. And there we were living in an almost completely Mexican rural environment. Of course, we would come back the other 9 months, would be in between. School was an Anglo environment, and home was a combination of both. But I have very pleasant memories of Brownsville. It was semi-rural, and at the same time it had most of the advantages of the time of a city.
And your parents, who are they?
Oh, they were both passed away now. My father belonged to the people that settled that area, which was originally Nuevo Santander, and it was supposed to extend from the Pánuco to the Nueces, because the section from the Nueces to the Rio Grande was part of that colony, which later became Tamaulipas. Of course, the Texans who took over Texas ended at the Nueces, coveted that piece of territory because of the livestock, and they finally took it away. But my people, my father's people, came to that area in 1580. And they didn't come through Mexico City, they came directly to Tampico and then inland. There were a colony of Sepharditas, supposedly converted Spanish Jews, though most of them still kept many of their ideas. They were very anti-clerical, but later, in 1749, a group of them, by the way, those families included the Hinojosas, Rolando Hinojosa's family also. They came up with a escandón to settle the lower Rio Grande. And my family, Rolando's Hinojosa family, all of those came about the same time. So really those families settled what is now known as the lower Rio Grande Valley, and had lands and cattle all the way down to the Nueces. So we were very closely involved with the history of the area. Later, when the northern part of what became Tamaulipas was taken from us, all of those things, we remembered them. So I grew up with a great deal of knowledge of our past history.
Did you read when you were young?
Oh yes. I began to read in Spanish before I went to English school, And my father and my eldest brother taught me simple things. I learned to write with block letters. And my father received at least La Prensa de San Antonio, but other newspapers. And there were books in Spanish in the house. So I started reading those even before I went to school.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, school, even though it was in English, was easier, I think. I'm a very strong advocate of bilingual education. I think it really helps to know more than one language. So, at the same time, especially in the summers, when we would go to the ranch, my father would be down there too. The old men would talk about the old days. For example, my great-grandfather fought at Palo Alto in La Resaca as a regular cavalry, and they had very little use for Arista and Filosola to try to fight European style against an army that was vastly superior in firepower and training. They wanted to fight guerrilla style. All of those things I've heard since I was very young. Mm-hmm. And stories about abuses by the Texas Rangers. All of that was imprinted on me as a very young child.
Mm-hmm.
When you were 19, it said that you won a statewide poetry contest. Could you tell us a little
Yes,
about
I think
your
I
poem?
may have been a little younger, I don't remember. But again, my father's people were very, very interested in poetry. In fact, they wrote it. If you want to check on that, you might look at it. It has been published in, that article has been published in Folklore and Culture on the Texas-Mexican border. It was edited by Richard Bauman. But I gave it, the original was given as a talk in honor of Galarza, the first Galarza lecture. People use a decima form, which is a difficult one. It's a 10-line stanza with a set rhyme scheme. I won't go into that, you can check. Just look at that, The Dying Love of Lindo Cordova, which is the name of the lecture I gave on for Galarza. And the people in my father's papers, for example, we found some decimas that he had written. People read a great deal, read poetry, and wrote this kind of poetry. So we were familiar with that sort of thing. The interesting thing about this contest that I won was that most of my teachers in school were very good, beginning with my grade school teacher who was a Mexican American. But for my junior year in high school, I had a teacher who, well, I would say she was a bitch. That's all she was.
Uh-huh.
And she didn't know very much. Now when this contest, it was Trinity College, which is now in San Antonio, but at that time it was in Waxahachie. They sent out flyers throughout the state announcing this contest. She never thought that anybody might want to do it. So the office just put the flyer on the bulletin board. I saw it there, I copied it, and on my own I sent no great poetry, but a sonnet on night, I remember. And it won the first prize. And the principal at that time was a very good man, way ahead of his time. Was impressed not only by the fact that I had won the contest, but I had done it completely on my own. So he came and asked me, who was your sponsor? I told him nobody. I sent it all by myself. And he saw that as a reflection on the faculty. So it was because of that poem and the fact that we had the principal of the high school was also the dean of the junior college. It all was in the same building. Because of that, he made it possible for me to attend junior college. I wouldn't have done otherwise. After graduation, I was standing around the street corner with a number of other people, and he went by he had a little roadster with a rumble seat. He saw me and he backed and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Nothing, looking for a job." And he said, "Are you going to junior college?" I told him, "No, can't afford it." And he said, "Well, did you apply for a student assistantship?" I told him, "What's that?" I didn't know what it was. The assistant dean, a very nice lady, but with his own prejudice, had advised Anglos. They were the ones that got the student assistantship. So it was July. He said, "Well, the deadline was April, but you write me a letter and I'll see you get one. That you get one." So I wrote him a letter, and I got a student assistantship that paid for the tuition. And I had to work like hell because with the student assistantship I did certain things. Then I also had a job in which I made the tremendous sum of $2 a week to be able to buy supplies and things of that sort, and school also. But I managed it for 2 years. And then, of course, that was it. But I credit old Mr. Irving, was his name, for having made it possible for me to continue my education later, because if I had not had those 2 years of junior college, I wouldn't have dared to come back to UT at the age of 35 to finish getting my bachelor's. But that was a result of that poem.
Did you, when did you learn to play guitar, and when did your interest develop in composing and singing?
Well, it developed, there were a number of people, especially on the Mexican side of the border, who played the guitar. One of them who really had been born in Texas, so I saw him often. He taught me the first strings, positions of the guitar, though my father didn't like the idea. But again, there when I finally had a job at this grocery store, somebody there had a guitar that he had bought at Sears Roebuck, and he never learned how to play it, so I bought it probably from him for very, very little money, and that's where I started playing the guitar. And composing, I started composing songs about the same time that I started writing poetry.
What music were you listening to?
Pardon?
What music? Were
Very
singers?
varied. In fact, I sometimes have felt that radio tends to reduce our horizons, because at that time we had a phonograph, and my father bought the kind of records he liked. Very often songs from the Diaz period, but very, very important historically later for me. And then what amounted to little vignettes, spoken vignettes. One of my brothers bought American music, St. Louis blues and so on. My father liked Caruso, for example. We had a lot of areas by Caruso. And my sisters liked some other things. Now later, when we bought a radio, we listened almost exclusively because my mother liked it, to Agustin Lara and XCW. And, but I think I had a very varied music experience. And of course, during the summers, that's where I learned the corrido, the decima.
You began proofreading and reporting for the Brownsville Herald. What were some of the experiences that you learned with the newspaper?
Well, I began working for the Brownsville Herald before I finished. Before I finished junior college, in fact, even as a high school student, I think I wrote a few things for them. And the first year of my junior college, I worked, as I said, for a grocery store where I worked a fantastic number of hours. I counted it, I didn't want to exaggerate, but I think it was something like almost 50 hours a week. So, but the second year, I got a job. And by the way, I was paid $2 a week at that place. I would work from 5 to 9 or 10 weekdays, on Saturdays from 7 a.m. to about 3 a.m., and on Sundays from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. supposedly, but usually we closed around 8. But I got a job with a man who worked for the Herald, but he also was a stringer for La Prensa. And what he would do, he would mark, we had 3 newspapers in the valley, Brownsville Herald, Valley Morning Star, and the Callan Monitor. He would mark items of interest in the English language papers, and my job was to translate them into Spanish. And he paid me the $2 a week for something that was I liked to do and didn't take very much time. Then when I finished at the junior college, I drove a bread truck for a few months until I got a job at the Brownsville Herald. Now there were 2 jobs open, cub reporter and proofreader. The cub reporter paid $10 a week. The proofreader paid 14 something. So I took the proofreader's job, and at the same time I kept writing feature articles and things of that sort, and then I moved on from there to a regular staff job. In 1940, when the war began at the end of 1935, World War I, I got a job at Pan American Airways, helping arm airplanes that went to Europe. They were manufactured in California, and they were flown to Brownsville. Brownsville had a very big air base at that time. It serviced all of Spanish America. And there we put 50 caliber machine guns. They were the heaviest weapons at that time for airplanes. The cannon weren't developed until later. And it was my job to see, I didn't do the arming or anything, but to see that it was done, take numbers and so on. So I had that job, which is a 40-hour-a-week job. I kept my job at the Brownsville Herald, working on weekends for the big Sunday paper, because at that time the 3 papers had been bought over by the same man Hudson. They published independently more or less during the week, but there was just one Sunday edition for all 3 papers, and that was out in Brownsville. And I worked in that, and I began to play on the radio for $15 a week. So I was swimming in money, about $45 a week, which is nothing for an angler, but for us. For me, it was very good.
What kinds of stories did you cover for the Brownsville Herald?
almost any story that has something to do with Mexicans, they would put me on it. But then I also, my eldest brother had moved to Matamoros during the Depression, and he was doing very well over there. He did own, after that, in the dry goods business. He had branched out into banking and other things. And he was interested, of course, in seeing that Matamoros business was written about. And the man who covered Matamoros didn't do that. He'd write about shootings, about what happened in the red light district. So I started writing about that too. I wrote about feature articles. When Charro Days started, I started writing articles that really were folklore. I didn't know that they were. I would write about how Sobre las Olas was developed. Most Anglo started with the German waltz. See? And things of that sort, or the pastorelas, a number of things of that sort. And I held those jobs. Really, I was not drafted because the job at Pan American was a government job. Until it got to me. My two younger brothers one was in the Aleutians, the other was ended up in the Battle of the Bulge. Some of the men that had played with me had been killed. So I started feeling very guilty, and I decided I'd quit the deferred job, because by that time I went and said I wanted to volunteer. I said, no, we're not taking volunteers anymore. Because if you were a volunteer, you could choose where you wanted to go, Navy, Air Force, whatever. And everybody wanted to go to the Air Force or the Navy. They said, we need foot soldiers now. So I had to wait until I was drafted into the Army, to the infantry. But about the time the war ended, and I ended up in Japan with Stars and Stripes, and I continued my career as a journalist until 1950 when I came back.
For the Stars and Stripes, what kind of articles did you write?
I began as a political editor by a fluke. The political editor had been fired because they discovered that not only was he a member of the Communist Party, but he had fought for the Republic in Spain. And, well, they didn't fire him, they just decided that he had been in the Army long enough. And then it happened that very day because I had been first as a stringer in a place called Okazaki. And I was writing articles of anything that came along. But when I came, I was walking from my billet to the paper. I found there was a big demonstration going on, so I stopped and found some Japanese who spoke English and got the material. I arrived with it and I gave it to the editor. So I was made political editor. I covered the war crimes trial, so-called, the political parties, and anything else. At that time, I started writing for El Universal in Mexico City. There were supposed to be weekly columns, but I didn't have time. I think I probably wrote 30, 35. Desde Tokyo, después desde China, when I went to China, and so on. And I was discharged in 1946, but I got a job with the international branch of American Red Cross as public relations officer for China. So that's when I went to China. And after Red Cross, the last 2 years, editing an army, little army magazine for the army.
What was it like?
What?
What was it like in Asia after the war?
The worst place that I went was Korea at that time. Luckily, I just stayed there a few weeks. There was nothing. In China, the time I was there, I was recalled because the communists were taking over. My base was in Shanghai, and I traveled all along up to Manchuria. There was a lot of poverty, but I wasn't suffering from it. And in Japan, of course, we lived a separate life. The people that worked for the army, because the American personnel there lived as though they were in a great big army post. We followed army regulations, even though later we were civilians. For example, I kept wearing a uniform during the time I was with the Red Cross. When I was doing this magazine, I didn't wear the uniform anymore. But there was a lot of poverty, destruction, of course. But in all three countries that I visited, there was an impulse to get to the top again. The Japanese are very, 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 very hard workers.
Mm-hmm.
I got along with them very well.
Mm-hmm.
Later I married half Japanese.
Right, yeah. There are two poems in Between Two Worlds that are very interesting to me. One is a César Augusto Sandino, in Spanish, and then the other one is Westward Ho the Empire. Right?
Yeah.
Is that
Westward, I can't remember the complete
right?
title.
Yeah. Could you comment on the first one, on César Augusto Sandino? How did that poem come about?
Well, that goes back to my very young years, because Sandino, I think that poem says Cinco años después de su muerte. It was written in 1939. Sandino was assassinated, murdered in 1934. But looking back on it, Sandino fought a kind of Vietnam War. He stayed in the jungle, the Marines went after him, and they lost a number of casualties. I noticed even then that the English language papers sort of played down the casualties, while the Spanish language papers had photographs of the American dead and so on. And of course, everyone that I knew, Spanish-speaking people, were very, very strongly for Sandino. It was the same thing over and over again. In this case, the imposition of a government in Nicaragua that would favor the United Fruit Company. And the United Fruit Company was doing what had been done during the Diaz regime in Mexico. They would go in and clear out banana groves and so on, so that the people there would go work for the oil company. So I was not alone in my admiration for Sandino. In fact, I have been asked what my heroes of that period were. I can think of three: Sandino, later Lázaro Cárdenas, and just about that time, a young woman, well, older than I, named Emma Tamayuca, who was fighting for justice in San Antonio to become a shelter strike. She ended in jail several times. I admired her very much, and I think I used a little bit of her in a story of mine, The Hamon and the Beans.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't write that sonnet about Sandino when he was killed, because I hadn't honed my skills On the 5th anniversary of his death, that's when I wrote that.
Uh-huh.
The other one is called Westward, the Course of Empire.
Empire, right.
I thought that, and I was not alone in thinking that the trial of the Japanese leaders was a farce. It happened that, this is another little story that fits in there. I was covering the stories, and there was a little lieutenant who was the PRO for the people there. And of course he was a lieutenant. I was a sergeant. And one day one of the other defendants lost his cool or began to babble, and he reached over. Tojo was sitting below him, and he slapped Tojo's bald pate. And of course the whole thing was settled down, and I called this man neurotic behavior. Now there's a great deal of difference between being neurotic and being psychotic. Well, that appeared in that day's paper. Next morning that I came, I was there with all the rest of the men covering the trials were American foreign correspondents. And there was, in that group also was the chief, the commander of the MPs guarding the defendants. A big, tall major, with a big head, cut short, very white hair. And this lieutenant comes up to me and starts chewing me out. And of course I stood there in attention. And he kept telling me, you don't think you're going to get these sons of bitches out? They're guilty and so on. And he kept going on. Meanwhile, the civilian correspondents, under the breath, but he could hear it, son of a bitch, son of a bitch. Anyway, he finished and he left. And this MP major, I forget whether it was a lieutenant colonel major, came up to us and said, if we want to get a revenge of these bastards, why don't we take them out and shoot them? Because after all, what their troops did, our troops also did. And he started telling, he had also been in the detail that guarded Hamon, who was hanged in the Philippines. He said, Hamon would tell me, I've seen my men who are not dead have with their mouths broken, where American soldiers broke their jaws to take out the gold teeth, and they would save them. Well, somebody got to this guy, because next morning he came in and told me, I don't know this guy, do you want to meet Tojo? Now, you know, if you're going to interview anybody, especially somebody as big as the head of the Japanese army, you want to be prepared. So I said, yes. So he took me, come this way. I went, he opened the door, pushed me out, there was Tojo. So all I could do was, I didn't have any questions prepared, and I asked him how he was, how did he feel. We talked just past, shot the ball, you might say. I didn't have anything prepared to tell. And so I met Tojo. He looked like a very nice, inoffensive person. Of course, as a militarist, he certainly wasn't. But that was what I did mostly. Though I wrote other stories that ruffled the bureaucracy, American bureaucracy. I went out with a Japanese friend, New English, and we interviewed some farmers, and they complained that they weren't getting any salt for the food, they weren't getting any any seed to plant. Meanwhile, the stories being put out by the official bureaucracy, these were civilians, for that they were doing a wonderful job. So I wrote a story on that. And one of the big civilians phoned me and said that I had it all wrong. So, well, can you tell me something about it? I said, yeah. Oh, could I go over to your office and talk to you? I went over, he didn't have anything to say, really. So I did a number of interesting things with it.
Mm-hmm. And you had an attraction to Japanese culture?
I already had, I think, I had read about it.
Uh-huh.
And I know the cruel side of it, but all our cultures have their cruel side. We, Mexicans, suffered a great deal. The American Army went into Mexico, did committed atrocities that we don't hear very much about. But I liked their culture, I did. I never learned enough. I learned enough Japanese to communicate, but you can't really learn a language unless you learn to read and write it. And Japanese is, you need years and years. You have to learn 2 syllables and then the Chinese characters. And to read a newspaper, I understand you have to know something like 3,000 of them. So I forgot my Japanese.
When you returned to the United States, you were enrolled at UT Austin. What was, your feeling then about going back to school?
Well, for the last 2 years, when I was editor of this magazine, the magazine was distributed to the troops. Every week we would have an article with questions and so on. And the company commanders were supposed to gather the troops on Friday afternoon and have them read this and then discuss it. Of course, the troops were not particularly eager to do that. Later I found out that Rolando, José was one of those who got to spend his Friday afternoons not going to Tokyo but reading that. But I was doing that, and next, just across the street from it, was the U.S. Armed Forces College, which people called Tokyo College. I mentioned it in this collection of short stories, I mentioned that too. And I started getting ready. I took several courses by correspondence to UT, but I would take the exams under the aegis of Tokyo College. I remember the last course I took was one on the short story, just reading the short stories and so on. I think it was Maud Boatwright who taught it. Then I came to take the exam, and one of the questions was write a short story. You wouldn't have to answer the others. Well, I happened to have something in mind, but as I was going to start, somebody came running down the hall and opened the door and yelled, "The North Koreans have just invaded South Korea." So I wrote it anyway, and amended somewhat. It appears in this collection also as Brothers, I think I call it. But I remember going out after, I didn't know how I finished, but we were getting ready to come back. So I had a few courses, because I had just 2 years of college. Now I was coming with the intention of seeing if I could stay here until I got a PhD. But when we went to get our visas, I found out that we couldn't, because though my wife was an Uruguayan citizen, she was half Japanese, and at the time, people with 50% or more Japanese ancestry could not regain citizenship in the United States. So what we got, of course I could come and go because I was an American citizen. She got a visa for 6 months with the privilege of renewing that for 6 more months. So when we came here in 1950, I came already arranged I was going to finish my bachelor's in 12 months, and then we were going to go to the border. We would live in Matamoros, and I would try to get a job on this other side. And so I was taking a full load for 12 months. A full load with a little more because I took courses like ancient Greek, which gave me 4 hours instead of 3. At the same time, I was taking courses by correspondence. Later, I found out that you were not supposed to do that. But I have found out that sometimes if you don't ask, you can get away with it if I had asked. So I was taking a tremendous love. My wife, poor wife, did everything. I just studied, came home. I made the habit of taking notes as fully as I could, filling them up in the period after instead of having a cope with friends. Then when I came home, I would flesh that out on the typewriter. So I would have everything. And in 12 months, I finished the BA summa cum laude with straight A's. By that time, the people in the English department had decided they wanted me to stay. So I started teaching freshman English immediately after finishing. I had taken freshman English in 1934, fall of 1934. So I had some trouble not with the material, because I've been, in the intervening 14 years, I've been doing editorial work, but how to conduct a class. But I managed.
And your master's, did you have a master's thesis? Or?
Oh yes, another thing happened. At the time that I was working on my bachelor's, I emphasized courses that would make me as good a literary critic as I could. I took courses in writing, in criticism, and background. The last semester I took a course which was based on I.A. Richards' practical criticism. This was way, way back. And the teacher, the instructor, was a man, became a good friend of mine later. What he did, he would give us every week 2 texts, which he picked from sources that he felt none of us knew about. And we were supposed to compare them and say which of the 2 was better. Piece of cake as far as I'm concerned, of all the editorial work I had done. Except I had 2 places. The one I just mentioned because the other one was the important one. He gave us one which I recognized one of the sources immediately because I read a great deal when I was a boy. I read all the Tarzan books I could find, and it was the end of the first book, Tarzan of the Apes. So I wrote, well, this was written by Edgar Rice Burroughs. It is, of course, very popular literature. He uses a number of cliches and so on. But I found at least that it's clearly written. This other piece seems to have been written by an old lady, and I didn't like it. So he called me and tells me, well, this piece that you said was written by an old lady was written by Henry James. Well, I have not changed my mind about Henry James. But he had given me a B, but then he changed it to an A-. That was my first bad step. But the other one that changed my course of study was he gave us two versions of the same Scottish ballad, Sir Patrick Spence. And of course it was clear that the first one began with "The king sits in Dunfermline town, drinking the blood-red wine." So the other one said, "The king sits in Dunfermline town, a-drinking of the wine." And I told him, well, A reads much better, but this was meant to be sung. The drinking of the wine sounds much better when it's sung. And then you have to take other things. Of course, the criticism of the time did not. You were not supposed to worry about who wrote it when the context was not important. I said, here, the context is very important. And then I brought something about the corrido. So he told me that I should go talk to Robert Stevenson, who taught, among other things, taught a couple of courses in folklore. I went to see him, and I changed over to folklore. Stevenson, by the way, was an associate professor both in English and in Spanish. So that's how I came to write on El Corrido de Gregorio Cortés. Mm-hmm. And my PhD is a very varied one because I wrote it in the English department. Since it was about balladry, I was required by the English department to take courses in medieval balladry. But I took a number of courses in Spanish. I think I took more graduate courses in Spanish than in English. And I also had to be examined on American literature and in Spanish literature. And finally I ended up and my dissertation was supposedly in English with a medieval bias, but my topic was El Corrido de Gregorio Cortés.
In your education, do you recall what critics you read in English and what critics you read in Spanish? I'm thinking, the very strong ballad tradition in Hispanic.
Yes, of course, Menéndez Pidal and Menéndez Pelayo, especially those two in Spanish. Of course, I was interested in what had been done in Mexico, but most of it was not was impressionistic. There weren't any real studies. The great corrido scholar in Mexico was Vicente Mendoza. He was really a collector more than anything else. And of course in the English, Kittredge and others of that sort, but to a great extent I had to make my own category because nothing had been done really.
And you had to take the traditional courses also? I mean, the British Romantics. Did you take those courses too?
Yes, some of them. Of course, Shakespeare, Chaucer, history of the English language. Though UT Department of English at that time had a strange situation. They had courses that seniors could take and were also graduate courses, but they weren't very strong, mucho fondo. But also I was taking El Cid and the history of the Spanish language and two courses on the Siglo de Oro, and one I think on the 14th, 15th, 16th century, which was when the Romance was written. So it was a very varied background, which is reflected in my library. I don't have a library that any resembles what any scholar might have. The great majority is on one subject. Right. Mine is scattered out in many kinds of subjects.
When did you come across a modernism, Anglo-American modernism, or T.S. Eliot, writers like that?
Well, I had read T.S. Eliot even before I went to war. I had read some of his things. We didn't study it in school, or if we ended with it, I suppose Chesterton and some of those. But at the Herald, there was a man, Hart Stillwell. He wrote a few things. In fact, he published a book called Border City. So he used me as a resource person. But at all events, he lent me books every once in a while. So my horizons really began by reading some books I borrowed from, and that included Eliot and also translations of Gorky and others, other Russian writers. And then when I was in the years I spent in Japan after I finished my year with the Army, as I say, there was, Tokyo College as we called it, was just across a narrow street from my office. So I was always taking out books. That is where I read a good deal. I read Faulkner there for the first time, and a number of other writers, because my job allowed it. What happened was that we had less and less work to do. And this happened in all bureaucracies, not only in Army bureaucracy. They try to hold on to the staff because it meant prestige with upper people. So I had less, as the editor, I had less and less work to do. I would give something for everybody to work on, and then I would read, edit what they did, put it together. And reading was part of the job. As long as you weren't reading comic books or things like that. So with the Tokyo College next door, I did a lot of reading. I remember reading Faulkner, a good bit of many things. And that helped me when I came to get finished my undergraduate degree, because I read most of what they were teaching. I can't remember his name now. What is his name? I'm beginning to forget names.
You have a beautiful poem titled Guitarreros.
Oh, yes.
It's in free verse, and it's very imagistic.
More or less, yes.
More or less,
And that I wrote, I guess I never found my voice poetry, because that goes back to my very beginnings. I think I was in junior college when I wrote that, though it didn't get published until later. And I was writing a lot of junk, some of which got published at the same time.
Have you ever been asked to read your poetry?
No, and I would say no. I just don't feel. No, I didn't feel that way when I had a voice to play, to sing. I used to give a lot of singing lectures. I remember once being, of course that was before your time, I think, being at UCLA and giving a singing lecture of that sort. But because I had experience as a performer in music, but not in. Now when I was young, before I went to the Army, there was a group of us, including Salas Clan, to whom I dedicate Mi Pueblo, and Paredes and others. We used to get together, go to Matamoros, things were very inexpensive in those days. We could go out there and get a meal for, I don't know, in which you could order at least 3 kinds of meat, including quail and venison, because at that time it was a wilderness south of Hamon. And we go and eat and drink and recite poetry at each other. And then sometimes riding around in Brownsville, we would try new poems for each other. But I don't think I would have some of the poems in Spanish I think I could have, but not the ones in English, especially the ones that I'm beginning to tend toward later. And I don't have a voice anymore.
You wrote George Washington Gomez between the years 1936 to 1940?
Yes, I may have already begun it. 1936 was when I graduated from junior college. I know that I had used the name Wellington Gomez when I was in college, junior college, as a pen name to write scurrilous little poems of different sorts that we would put on the bulletin board, because I went to high school and junior college in the depths of the Depression. We didn't have an annual or anything of that sort. The name Wellington Gomez, you might find of interest. For some time we lived toward the edge of town. We used to live close to 14th Street, but then my father decided he wanted to move out. And we had a very nice place, and almost everything was brought. A man would come by with meat, another one with vegetables and so on. But the groceries, my father, one of my older brothers, would take a list to town to a grocery store that was, I think it was on Washington Street, but right close, I don't know how Brownsville is like, or whether you know what Brownsville is like, but there was a fountain, which was more or less the center of the town. And Garcia Gomez was just across the street in Washington. And there's where they would bring the groceries. And of course they always put in a bag of pilon. I don't know whether you're familiar with the word pilon. A bag of candy. So my younger brothers and I were always waiting for Garcia Gomez to bring the groceries. And they were the ones that, of course, he was on Washington Street. And somehow they got all mixed up and they called the man that brought the groceries Wellington Gomez, instead of Garcia Gomez on Washington Street. And that's where I picked up the name Wellington Gomez.
Why did you take so long to publish the book?
Oh, because nobody wanted to publish it. And we haven't. I was writing short stories also. 2 of the short stories I wrote in that period were The Hamon and the Beans, and well, no, it was much later that I wrote Over the Wages. But The Hamon and the Beans was one that I wrote before 1939, including others that have disappeared. Now, we were very poor. To take a big manuscript and send it out, I didn't even know where. Now, a short story, I could afford to send it out. And The Hamon and the Beans did the rounds beginning about 1939. I came back from the Army, and again I sent it out. Nobody was interested in it. So that discouraged me. And I never sent out one to George Washington Gomez. It was too big. I put it away. with a lot of other papers. It wasn't until I think around 1963 I had been writing a few things for the Observer, the Texas Observer here, and I knew Ronnie Duggan pretty well. And he asked me for something else. So, well, I don't have anything, but I have a short story. I told him. Well, he said, let me see it. And he saw the Hamon of the Bees and he liked it. He published it, and it just took off. It has been reprinted and reprinted and reprinted. So something must have been wrong there. I think what happened was that before that, people were not interested in anything that resembled the real life of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. I remember one, I think it was here in the Southwest Review. They read it, said they liked it, but there should be more about Chonita. What they wanted was some triacle, some sentimentality. And then the other one that got published, I think, a little earlier, or wrote it later, was Over the Waves is Out. But that was all. Then what happened was that a group of people, including Ramon Saldivar, who was here at that time, a group of students and young colleagues who had seen, I had been publishing some things in verse in little occasional ephemera that were put out by Chicana. I think I published a few things. And they encouraged me to get some of them together and see if Nick Canellas would be interested in them. So I got them together with the understanding that some of these people, young people, would read them and give me their impression, because I was I didn't have very much confidence in my own stuff. Well, nobody ever answered me except Ramon Saldivar. And finally he came and told me the ones that he would like. So I sent them to Nick Canellas. He said he would publish them. But I didn't have a title. I just wrote versos varios. So for several times we either wrote or phoned each other. He would suggest a title. I said I don't like it. Then I would suggest a title. Meanwhile, one time he asked me, don't you have any prose? I said, well, somewhere I think I have a novel. I haven't seen it for a long time. I said, well, dig it up. A bunch of other papers I found George Washington Gomez. I sent it to him, and I think it was published before the verses. But finally, Rolando Hinojosa was the one that suggested Between Two Worlds, and we got that one published. That was how it got published. And just recently, I found another one. Now that isn't that old. It won a prize in 1955 when I was a graduate student. I got $500 actual money for it. The Shadow. And again, everybody praised it, but nobody wanted to publish it. So Nick Canellas was here not too long ago. In fact, he was here for the lecture series in my honor. And he asked me what I had to, will I have this? But it's not along the lines of other things that I've written. I said, well, send it over. I've sent it over almost 2 months ago. I haven't heard from him. Perhaps he doesn't like it. That is really the criticism as of people that look through that, not the people on this side. Really the people that consider themselves cultured and looking down on the rancheros or the Indians.
And this is a novel?
Pardon?
It's a novel?
It's a novel, but a very short one.
Mm-hmm.
The thing was that it was a short novel when it won the prize, nobody would publish it, so a number of well-meaning people started telling me, well, if you change this here, you will do it. I did it. Pretty soon it was no longer recognizable by me. So what I did now is try to remove all of that, and I may have pruned a little too much. So it'll be a very short little novel.
And it's you looking at Mexico.
Pardon?
You looking at Mexico and
Looking
Mexican
just at the
society.
side. Really, it's about a group of agraristas that have established a colony among the old riverbank peoples there. And there's some friction, of course. I got it because some of my uncles were among those that were losing a little bit of land, and one of them, who was a very sharp man, became good friends with the Presidente, and after that his lands weren't affected. But the Presidente, that was what my uncle, who was my mother's brother, told us, that the man got sick. And when he was dying, he told my uncle what was wrong with him. He said that he had been walking, or rather riding, but he was walking his horse along a road in their territory, when all of a sudden he had seen a shadow in front of that scared the horse. Got down, there was nothing. But after that, he started feeling bad. Now this particular man was a Marxist, and he no longer believed even in religion, much less in superstition. But apparently it was a battle between his head and his brain and his emotions, because he probably felt he had been frightened. He had to be cured of suicide. But he would die rather than lower himself into that position which he had risen. So there was, I saw in him a kind of snobbery, really, because he looked down on his men, whether full of superstition. Then I moved that up. There is a general who comes to the ejido when this man is dying, and he thinks they're all savages, including this man is dying. So what I try to do is put a kind of a layer of not racial prejudice, but class prejudice, which I think we find very much among educated Mexicans.
In your, you received the Order of the Águila Azteca from the Mexican government, and yesterday we came upon your acceptance.
Oh, you've seen the acceptance
Yes,
speech?
I've seen the acceptance speech.
Where did you find it?
Margot
Gutierrez, the librarian.
¿Quién?
Margot
Margot
Gutierrez.
Oh,
Gutierrez.
Margot Gutierrez, of course she has it.
Yeah, and it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I was not going to let go the opportunity of telling them what we thought of them because of what they think of us. Yeah, when it was over, this, because the Águila Azteca was given to 3 people, Chavez was one, and Julián Zamora also. I didn't go because my health is like an old prize fighter. I'm down and I'm up and I'm down and I'm up. But anyway, I didn't go. So they came and gave it to me here. And the man who represented the government, when he left, he said, muy bien, pero llevaba cuchillo.
Yes, you had some comments for Vasconcelos
Uh-huh.
and for Octavio Paz.
Octavio, yes, Vasconcelos was crazy, really. And the thing is that most Chicanos at least have read his Raza Cósmica or empowered him and aren't aware that he changed his mind completely. And later he called it La Raza Cómica, especially in La Tormenta. He talks about getting to a place where he's running away. I mentioned that he's carrying a lot of tesoros. I decided not to go all the way because one of the tesoros he was carrying was his mistress. He left his wife over in the cauldron of revolution in Mexico. But anyway, he reaches a town that's very clean. It's in Monterrey, around there. Very much it reminded him of the town in Campeche, except that this was even better because there were no Indians, porque por allá hay mucha gente buena. So you can see how much he had changed. That he no longer cared about the mestizo, the Raza Cósmica. He wasn't all there, really. Another thing that's not often mentioned is mentioned in the Tormenta. He translated Plotinus, and was very well known for that. But it isn't mentioned that when he fled Mexico, he went to New York and looked at all the English translations of Plotinus, and he found that they helped him a lot. So he used the Gringo translations for his translation. But anyway.
And Octavio Paz?
Pardon?
Octavio Paz?
Octavio Paz, again, what he said about the Pachuco, and that again is something that is not very often noticed. He called him, estaba hablando en español, pero hizo la palabra clown. Es un clown, el Pachuco. Coles tenía miedo también, because it was but he never notices that the kind of situation those poor guys were in. I mean, they had to know English any way they could to be able to survive. And it was a matter of survival. He isn't aware of that. Then something that I don't mention that, but I mentioned it in another place. Paz, after he resigned from he was ambassador of India. He resigned because of the Tlatelolco business. He came and spoke here at the university. I was there. Most of those that were there were young Anglos who had transcended the prejudices of their parents. And what does Paz do? He started talking about La Matanza en Tlatelolco, and then he says that he relates it to the tapado. He's always been very interested in masks. And he said behind the tapado, and he was talking about the Mexican government, is a figure of the Aztec priest with a bloody obsidian knife. What he was saying is, Mexicans are by race a bloody people. I was completely disgusted about it. So Margot kept that one.
Yes.
I know she wasn't the only one. When the talk was over, somebody, I forget who, came and asked me whether he could borrow it to make a copy, but I think a lot of other people made copies because a copy appeared in Brownsville also, different places. Well, I'm happy that it did.
Yes, it's an important document, actually. It really is.
Well,
Yeah.
I crossed out the English translation at the last thing I said in Spanish because I felt that it would weaken what I said in Spanish.
Would you, for the camera, would you care to repeat the circumstances of the publication of With His Pistol in His Hand?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, it began as my doctoral dissertation, and it just happened that Stiff Thompson, who was the most highly regarded folklore scholar both in the States and in Europe, came here as a visiting professor after having retired, because the first place he taught was here in the English department. In fact, he was head of the freshman English for a year. And he was put on my committee since I was writing on folklore. He liked the manuscript and told me, in fact, that he was recommending that it be published by the University of Texas Press. Well, at the end, that was 1956, at the end of the year, I think, because I taught until the end of summer, I went to Texas Western, which is now UT El Paso, and the director of the press called me over there and told me that they hadn't had the manuscript, they liked it very much, but they would insist on certain changes, that I would have to remove all my derogatory remarks about well, he wasn't a doctor anyway. All he had was an MA, Professor Webb, but everybody called him Dr. Webb. And also remove all my criticisms of the Texas Rangers, because the press felt that they might be sued. So I told him, well, Frank, why don't you just send the manuscript back to me? And I'm sure he thought that I would publish it somewhere else. As a manuscript, the University of Texas Press would not publish it. So he published it. I mean, I should not use the word publish. He printed it. Because to publish something, you have to bring it before the public. But it was never brought before the public. At that time, the press was beginning, so they made a great to-do about their publications. They usually had a autograph party at the co-op. Nothing like that happened. So it wasn't until the Chicanos in California discovered the book that it really began to sell and began to be known. Some people found it because it was bought, I guess, by the library. That is how you say that you found it. That was the way that Tomás Rivera told me that he had found it and read it. But it was that way that they discovered it and made it known. And then there was a new director anyway, and then it began to be bought, and it still is in print. It's 1958.
And still very current. It still holds up from 1958 to 1996.
And I have this novel, I guess you know everything, published since then. You know about Uncle Remus Conchile and the short stories, the poem, the novel. And I hope, well, let's say if I live to be 100, to begin to do a number of sketches, not so much autobiographical, but dealing with people I knew. One will be about my Tia Pilar, everybody knows, because I spoke about her at Southwest Texas, who certainly did not fit the stereotype of the Mexican woman who is subservient, who will take anything. Tia Pilar was a dead shot with a 30-30 Winchester. She shot mostly at gavilanes, but one time it was said that she never missed. Only one time did she miss. She missed her target because a mule got in the way, and she killed the mule. It was just as well because her target was her son-in-law, who had beaten her daughter. So I have a lot more to say about that.
I wanted to ask you, if you were to teach a Chicano literature class, what books would you choose for your class?
Well, there's been so much written, published lately that haven't kept up with. Well, I used to teach what amounted to a Chicano literature class, but there were fewer books there. Of course, I would use Tomás Rivera, and a representative book of Rolando y José, and some of the older ones, but I would have to be very careful about those. The cockroach people. There's so many of them, you would have to have 2 semesters, I think, because some good things are being published nowadays. And you're going to have some very, very outstanding books because of the volume of them. I remember in 1970, I think, we had a convention, or whatever you want to call it, here. And we broke up into discussion groups, and I got the group for literature. And I was telling them that was way back, but that they should encourage the publication as much as possible, because in order to have a so-so, even a mediocre work, literature, you have to have many bad ones. And out of those mediocres, you would have some good ones. And you had to have a climate, in other words. And one young man got up and challenged me. So, everything that Chicanos write is great. Which one? I mean, I think not even Tomas had published his work then. But now we do have that literary climate. We have a number of houses publishing it. We have critics like yourself and the Saldívar brothers and others. So it won't be so easy to decide what you would want to teach in a course in Chicano literature. You might have to do later on what you do in English literature and others. Decide some particular section to teach.
In 1952, you won another prize, right? From the Dallas Times.
Oh yeah, Dallas Times Herald.
Right.
That was $500 again, worth of books.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember. Oh, that was a group of short stories, some of which include some of those that were published in the Hamon and the Beans, including one that the judges liked a great deal, A Cold Night, but nobody would publish it. It's strange how editors' viewpoints fluctuate.
Did you give it the title Border Country? Was that your title?
For the contest,
Uh-huh.
I just took some stories and sent them in under that title, and they did win the prize, which I think was $500 worth of book. Later, with The Shadow, I got $500 worth of contantes y sonantes, money. I think that's the most I've ever God for anything they were.
As a professor in the late 50s at UT Austin, yeah. Were you aware of other Mexican American professors? Did you know them or meet with them?
I started teaching, remember, when I was a graduate student, 51, and of course I was aware of Don Carlos Castañeda. In fact, though he was born in Camargo, he was raised in Brownsville. One of his sisters was my first grade teacher. So I knew about him. I would meet him on the elevator only, but he was always very busy. And he died very soon after. And of course Sanchez. George Sanchez had come to us from New Mexico. But I would get to know him much better. Of course, he lasted much longer, I think. I don't know how many years since I got here Carlos Castañeda lived, but I knew him. He had written a number of books. So I read them, and I was disappointed with the Mexican side of the Texas Revolution. Of course, it was a series of documents. I expected them to be there saying green was telephone. In other words, what I would like to have done and what I did later. Right. He was a real scholar, not an activist. I think those two, and there was a man about my age in pharmacy with an M.A., Moreno, can't remember. Those were the only ones. There was another man in speech, Villarreal, but he called himself Villarreal, and I don't know whether he even spoke Spanish.
And in the United States, were you aware of anybody else? Or?
At that time, no. I remember, for example, when I read Jack London's stories in Mexico. Really, for me, it opened doors. I said that in, I think in something I wrote, or something called Nearby Places and Strange Sounding Names. You familiar with that? I mentioned there for a while. I thought perhaps Jack London was a Chicano. There were very few. There were people writing like Helen Hunt Jackson writing Ramona and things of that sort. Most of what was written about it wasn't worth reading. Now in Spanish, there were people like Perales, Alonso Perales, who wrote in defense of the Raza, and there were a number of things being written. But also, La Prensa was publishing novels. They had lost out on Los de Abajo, that was published in El Paso, I think. But they published some novels, none of them that I think was particularly memorable. But I don't know. I would have to try to remember, because sometimes one forgets. I don't remember that. I was reading things in Spanish, but they were by Mexican and Spanish authors. For example, El Zarco, Los de Abajo, things of that sort. But I don't remember that we had people like names Carlos Castañeda. I couldn't remember his name all of a sudden. By the way, there's no telling what he went through, because one of his favorite jokes had to do with the way his name was spelled, because I don't know why Anglos tend to juxtapose names. Instead of calling him, of course, they would drop the Enya, but instead they would call him Mr. Castinada. And he used to say, well, as long as I don't take the Casti off, it's okay. But I think there was a little bit of bitterness.
Right.
He was never completely accepted.
Yeah. In the early 70s, when the Chicano movement began, you were part of
Well, of course, Tomas.
founding the
Tomas and others, I'm trying to think of it. Most of them coming not from Boston, but from other places. Of course, I don't know whether Bless Me Ultima came out at that time or later, but was the Road to the Cultural People?
right.
Yeah, that came out about that time. There was another, I'm trying to think of his name, who wrote Peregrinos de Islam.
Miguel Méndez.
Mendes, that's right. He's from the 70s.
Right. Yeah. And you were involved in the Mexican American studies? at
Oh,
Texas?
yeah.
Yeah.
I came here with the intention of, I started folklore studies, Center for Folklore Studies. And I was lucky about that time, 67, that I was given an appointment in anthropology. In fact, they bought half of me. It was the sports section, because very often you have an appointment, a courtesy appointment. In my case, no, half of my salary came from anthropology, half from English. It helped me because English did not treat me badly, except that they wouldn't give me any raises. Very soon, assistant professor would make more than I was, and so that changed because the man who was chairman of the anthropology department, Rick Adams, his specialty was Guatemala, was the one who asked me to come in. I came in as a full professor. And he always saw that anthropology gave me some kind of a raise. And since whatever raise they gave me, they only paid for half of it, the English department had to come up with the other half, whether they wanted to or not. But the great thing that anthropology did for me was that I could teach courses where I could require a knowledge of the Spanish language. I remember that the first time I taught a course like that, first thing I said, the class was full, people were sitting on the window ledges, and a good number of them left, said it was unfair. But the ones that stayed and watched Chicano were very happy. But I felt that you had to know the Spanish language if you're going to do this sort of thing. Anyway, we finally got a Center for Mexican American Studies begun, so I passed the Folklore Center on to Richard Bauman. He's the editor of this book, Folklore and Culture on the Tex-Mexican Border. And I took over the Mexican American Studies Center, which was a fight all the way. Finally, I resigned to make them give us some kind of a budget. And they kept asking me to come back, and I refused. I remained in the wings, cheering them on, going to meetings. But that was when I started teaching classes, for example. There is still, I think, Rolando Hinojosa teaches it, a class, Life and Literature of the Southwest. I taught it Life and Literature of the Southwest, the Mexican experience, with nothing but books that had to do with Mexico. And that class, of course, that was all in English. But when I taught folklore of Greater Mexico, they had to know Spanish.
Mm-hmm. Comments on J. Frank Dobie or Walter Prescott Webb?
Well, if you read George Washington Gomez, you get a very negative view of Dobie. I really didn't know him very well. I'll tell you what I knew about Dobie at that time. He had come and he had spoken, I don't remember whether it was when I was in junior college, it must have been in junior college. He gave a talk. He was not very impressive. Dobie was very good speaking to small groups. And he told a couple of jokes and so on. So I was very neutral about Dobie there, but immediately after that I went into the newspaper. And Dobie at that time was at the height of his popularity. And there were article after article about what Dobie said about Mexicans. He was supposed to know more about Mexicans than the Mexicans knew about themselves. The one that I remember, because that was the one that bothered me the most, was Dobie gave the origin of the word wetback. Now, as you know, we use the word mojado. In fact, I remember when I was in grade school, you know how cruel kids can be. All of a sudden I saw a kid running around the playground and a bunch of others chasing him. They finally caught him, held him down while everyone wet their fingers and touched the back of his ears. Está mojado. Where the mojado was supposed to be, mojado was in back of his ears. Because obviously if you've been in the water, that's the last thing that dries out. But mojado could not be translated to wet because that was during the Prohibition days, the wets and the dries. So somebody thought of calling it wetback. Now Dobie explained why. He said when a Mexican decided to come to Texas, he swam the river. And notice he was too stupid to take his clothes off and put them on a limb or he washed them. We used to cross the river all the time with our clothes and wash them just for the hell of it, to visit people and others. But he swims with all his clothes on. So when he gets on the other side, what does he do? Of course he's a Mexican. He has to take a nap. And he lies down on his back, and the sun dries all his clothes except his back. So when he gets up, his back is still wet. That infuriated me, I remember. Because, but I didn't have any way of, any outlet for that. Nobody in the paper would have taken an article to me on that. But when I wrote this novel, of course, I included that with it. When I met him here at the university, oh, he was, as far as Mexicans were concerned, something of a fraud, but a lovable, nice old fraud. Now, he never tried to talk Spanish to me. We would talk about other things, but he was a very nice person. Now, Webb was a different character. Webb was viciously racist, and I took him on, and some of the, I think it was a Smithsonian's hand and other places. And I used to meet him at that time, after the book came out. We were already in Parlin Hall, and I had a class somewhere, or perhaps I was going for lunch or something. I would always climb up to the mall and go along close to where the tower is, and very often I would meet him coming in the other direction. He always wore brown suits. And he would look at me, and if looks could kill, I would have dropped dead. He would look at me and wouldn't say a word. Well, after all the things I had said about him, I couldn't blame him. But sometimes we would have the meetings, or let's say coffees or something of that sort, where he would be there, I would be there, and he would come up and put his arm around my shoulder and make it appear as though he thought the whole world of me, in other words. And it was that hypocrisy that made me hate the past. So that, and again, he told other people that, one, that he didn't know why I picked on him. And that, well, the question was, oh, I knew that there were thousands of people, especially in West Texas, who thought the way he did. But there were uneducated farmers and ranchers. He was supposed to be an educated man. But he said that when he ever had a chance to reprint the book, he would change it. But he finally reprinted it and he didn't change anything. But that, he gave the impression, his feelings were hurt that I'd said all those things about him. And when he saw me, he was very, very cordial. But when he met me, it was just him and me. It was different. So I never forgave him because I never thought that he moved at least up to the point where J. Frank Dobie was. J. Frank Dobie still saw most Mexicans as picturesque. In fact, I take a little dig at him and Uncle Remus in Chile because he really is referring to, Dobie is really referring to Webb when he says that a great many people talk about Mexicans as being backstabbers and things like that stuff. But most of the Mexicans he had met were kindly Uncle Remus. And I told one before, fíjate lo que dice Webb, ¿quieres Uncle Remus? Sí, pero en Chile. So, well, it has to be, at least. So,
yeah. After the publication of With This Pistol in His Hand, I had read that a retired Texas Ranger threatened you and wanted to know
yes.
where you lived.
I was told, of course, I never met him, fortunately for me. He came to see the press Wardlaw, and Wardlaw did me a great favor then. He wanted my address to pistol whip me. He wasn't going to waste a bullet on me. But Wardlaw never gave it to him, and he convinced him that, because he said that he knew things had been written. So he said, well, why don't you write a book and we'll publish it? And he wrote a book. The only substantive parts he took from my research, and apparently that cooled him down. I never met him, I never saw him, but I knew that he was after my scalp. And there were a lot of others who wouldn't have minded to see something happen. No doubt about that.
How have you been able to resolve, this conflict, because of what you've written, what you've taught? The American public doesn't swallow it very easily. But how have you been able to, resolve it within yourself?
Resolve what? I don't.
Just, what you write. It's something that's very confrontational, that some people really don't want to hear about, but it's the truth. So, how have you learned to how would I say, be at peace with yourself?
Well, I'm at peace with myself being able to say these things. Once I say them, I feel better. No, I have not had, except for that unknown ranger that I never met. I know that some people have really hated me. There is a popular Western writer, I'm trying to think of his name begins with a K, I guess, who wrote a novel using the Cortez theme. And in the introduction he says that there is a professor at UT who wrote a very biased work about this novel. In fact, I met him year before last when the writers, TIL, Texas Institute of Literature, honored me, and he was there. His name begins with a K, can't remember. But and he said hello to me. He has his own feelings about me. That's his privilege. I'm not going to be have my feelings hurt because somebody doesn't agree with it. I'm sure there are some people that do. But a lot of young Anglos have come to see our side of some of the things I've written. No, I'm at peace with myself with what I've said. I'm not at peace with myself when I haven't said more. Because I don't have the energy to keep. And I think, as far as that particular thing is concerned, though, if I live long enough to do these series of sketches, I'll get some digs in there. For example, this one about the Tia Pilar. What I intend to do is mention also another very strong woman, Juana Pomoceno Cortina's mother. I say, I'm trying to say, well, Cortina is one of our heroes. Now, there are Anglos that think he was a bandit, but there are Anglos that think that David Crockett fought to the end in the Alamo swinging his trusty rifle. When everybody knows that was John Wayne, Crockett was hiding in the closet, and that's what they said. Some people are not going to like that, but I'll have a lot of fun saying it.
Yeah, any thoughts on Mexican-American culture?
Pardon?
Any thoughts on Mexican-American culture, what you've seen from your childhood to now? The way it's changed or
Pues,
future?
Lo más importante es que estamos mucho más despiertos de lo que estamos. The young people I would hope that most of our young people can become acculturated, because they need to, without becoming completely assimilated, becoming just gringos. Because we have a lot to add to general American culture. Just as, for example, American Jews have done with their literature. There's a lot of Yiddish material in it. In fact, they added a lot of words to the American language, Yiddish. And the writers are well known. I think our people could do that too.
Okay.
Well,
Thank
I'll
you.
talk.
Muchas gracias.
No, gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias a ustedes.
Muchísimas gracias.